All right, so hi everyone. My name is Tyler Bateman. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. And this paper is co-authored with Dan Silver, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto. And with Mark and Luke as well, what we've been looking at is invasive species policies cross-nationally, but this particular paper is going to be over time in Toronto. So the idea is to see when certain species and also just like certain other like broader taxa come up as a policy priority, and then also to see in the policies that do discuss invasive species, what kinds of ways do they discuss them, and what are like the different topics that come up when these policy documents are trying to deal with invasive species. So that's the general approach being taken here. So this presentation is reflective of what will be one journal article. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So the theoretical framing we're using for this paper is to think through different models of the social problems process. So in social science, there is this push when trying to understand social problems, trying to see the different stages a social problem, like invasive species, goes through while it's being defined and as it's being addressed. So this following picture is just one like sort of simplistic example of a social problems process. So this is a 6-step model. And so the first step of a model like this is to say the first step is claims making. So different people make claims that there's a social problem. So I think often the case with invasive species is it's natural scientists who are seeing in their data the problems arriving and also disrupting biodiversity, as Luke and Mark have been talking about, and having a variety of other effects on ecosystem services, and sounding the alarm and making the claim that a social problem exists, or an environmental problem, if you want to frame it that way. Then in this model, the idea is that, at least in some cases, the claims making leads to media coverage. So perhaps in invasive species, this is not quite how it works. It seems to kind of go from claims making to policy making immediately. So one of the purposes of this paper is to kind of interrogate these models and say which one like works best for the invasive species case. In any case, in this model, the third step is a public reaction to media coverage, followed by policy making. And the fifth step is what they call social problems work, when agencies are implementing the new policies and people are reacting to them, or the people implementing the policies are calling for other changes. And then the final step in this model is policy outcomes. So there are different types of responses to the new arrangements that have been created with the new policy. So this is just an example of one of these models. What we'll do is review many of these models, and in particular for this project, we're focusing on this part of the process, so the policy making process and how policies are reacted to. So one way our findings, as I'll show, can respond to this model is to say, after policy making and social problems work, part of that social problems work is the actual media coverage. Something like there's in the Toronto area, there's a species of invertebrate called the rusty crayfish, and So in a case like that, there's policies made, and that's one of the policy methods is to say, okay, we need media coverage talking about how rusty crayfish should not be used as bait, they should not be stored, etc. So in any case, so our paper will kind of speak to these different models of the social problems process and talk about in the invasive species case, which one seems to work best. And actually in our case too, we will talk a bit about the claims making because the policy making that we see does include some statements from biologists and others talking about invasive species as a problem. So yeah, this is the general framework we'll be using to think through this data. The framework being just different models of the social problems process. So this paper focuses on Toronto and an interesting way that Toronto manages invasive species is through a supra-municipal organization called the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, which was founded in 1957. Sorry, I just gotta admit someone to the waiting, or admit someone to, okay. All right, so all of the colored areas in this picture are managed by the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And the black line that you can see sort of going in between all of these areas is the Toronto city boundary. So you can see that the management area is much larger than the single city. And the idea here, as you may be able to guess by the shape of these management areas, is that rather than just managing invasive species within the city boundary, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority manages invasive species and other aspects of ecology from the watershed level. So these are all watersheds. There are 9 watersheds if you include the lakeshore area, which is that like darker blue color. So that's how this conservation authority manages invasive species as well as other things, is through this like watershed basis. So the policies are they're specific to one of these watersheds usually. So there's something like, I don't know, like the Don River Watershed Management Plan or something like that. So the methods that we used is to collect as many types of policy documents as we could from the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. It's a public sector organization, so they're required by law in Ontario to make their policy documents public. So we thought about policy in a general way. So basically any like written document that has some kind of government plan or a plan for a plan about managing invasive species. So all of the documents include a keyword, either invasive or exotic or alien, but focusing mostly on invasive. So the number of policies that we collected is 611. And the number of species included in those 611 policy documents is 1,556. I'm still in the process of cleaning up the data a bit, but as it is, when they mentioned a subspecies, I just entered that as a subspecies, and when they just mentioned a species, I entered that. So this number is a bit bigger if you were to lump. It is a bit bigger than it would be if you were to lump all of the subspecies in with the species. But yeah, I will probably clean that up as I keep working on this and just make it standard to species, unless there are cases where the subspecies really kind of act like and are managed as different species. And so the number of mentions of specific invasive species in these documents is 12,682. And and that number reflects just like if a species is mentioned more than once in a policy, it is only counted once. So there's actually more mentions overall of the species, quite a bit larger than that probably, or at least a bit larger. But yeah, so it's just like one mention per policy. Right, and so there are two types of mentions in these documents. So in some of them at the end of the policy, they will have like a list of species found in the area if they did like a biological inventory. So sometimes it's just like saying this species was found here. And then at other times, the record is actually like in the text of a policy when the Toronto Region Conservation Authority is discussing plans, or they will also like mention some species, or there is one species that has its own set of documents because, as I'll talk about, it's the most mentioned species. Yeah, so there's these two kinds of mentions. As I continue to work on this, I'll disaggregate those out and show like how the records relate to the mentions. But for now, they're lumped together in that 12,682 mentions. Okay, so now I'll just show like a broad overview of some of the patterns so far in the mentions of these species over time. So this groups all of the mentions at the level of like animals, plants, fungi. So like kingdom level, classical way of thinking about this. You can see here that in the mid-2000s is where things really start to take off for plants. Plants is the highest one here. The mentions for animals is quite a lot lower. So you can see the scale goes from about 0 to 15 or 1,250. So, the animals are much lower, and also fungi are even lower than that. If we were to zoom in on the animals graph, it looks like this. So you can see a trend of overall increasing numbers of mentions, but at the same time, there are these like peaks, which is a pattern in all of the graphs that we'll see. And that's probably, I'm guessing that's because every few years there's a reassessment of the situation. So there's like this periodic reassessment of the species. And that's probably what we're seeing there. But you can see also the overall trend going up. For plants, it doesn't look like there's an overall trend going up like after 2010. It seems kind of stable with these peaks. But still in the mid-2000s, you can see this sharp increase. And before that, very rare periodic mentions. And then for fungi, you can see that again in the mid-2000s, there's a little bit of a spike. And then after 2010, there's a bigger one. For the fungi, it seems like the main one discussed is butternut canker. It's a fungal infection of butternut trees. And from what I saw as I was coding all of this, I think that's the main spike there in the 2010s. It's expected that most butternut trees will die as a result of this and as a result of other factors. The decline in butternut is a bit mysterious still, from what I can understand in these documents anyway. Okay, so if we move into seeing some more detail in those plants, let me just check my time. Okay. The most mentions out of any species is dog strangling vine. The documents often just say dog strangling vine in just the English words, and it usually refers to Vincetoxicum rossicum, but sometimes they also mean to imply and sometimes do explicitly talk about Vincetoxicum nigrum. So that's the most mentioned species, followed by garlic mustard, European buckthorn, common reed, Manitoba maple, Norway maple, and purple loosestrife. Since about 10 years ago or so, I can't remember the exact date, but purple loosestrife has had a biological control introduced, which the policy documents say has been at least moderately effective. So that's one reason that it isn't higher. And yeah, so as you can see right now, kind of the biggest concern overall, so this is over all the document or overall categories. It's all plants, first of all, that's one of the trends. And then also that dog strangling vine is the most major concern. So if we look at the trend over time, you can see again this spike in the mid-2000s with dog strangling vine immediately and after that being the highest concern, or almost all the time being the highest concern. And you also see here this periodic spike when I think what the spikes mean is like a periodic reassessment. I'm not sure exactly what's happening yet with this dip in 2016 and 2017. I think, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what's happening with that, but I'll keep thinking through that and go more into the data to figure that out as this project continues. In terms of fish, these are all the species with more than 20 mentions. So the species that is mentioned the most is round goby, followed by European carp, sea lamprey, grass carp, and alewife. So there's a lot of talk in the policies, well, at least in 27 of the documents, or 28, about what is called, like the general name is Asian carp for species of carp. And grass carp is the only one that has actually been identified in any of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority watersheds, so that's why it's talked about the most. But there's a lot of worry about this issue, about the invasion that is likely coming from like the river coming through Chicago. So, So yeah, that's a little bit of an overview of that. So if you look at the patterns over time, you can see again this like periodic spike in interest, and also in general more interest starting in the mid-2000s. In terms of insects, so you can see that emerald ash borer is the most mentioned species. Usually when emerald ash borer is mentioned, it's kind of in a sort of desultory tone, in the sense that the documents say that they're expecting at least like a 95% die-off of ash trees as a result of the invasion of emerald ash borer. So it's not usually much about a management plan. It's kind of just talking about the effect, and that the Toronto Region Conservation Authority will have to plan to plant new trees as a result of the die-off of ash. Followed by Asian longhorn beetle, and this is more of a success story in the sense that it was found in I think it was mid-2000s, and then was quickly eradicated. So that one, it's just kind of a periodic reassessment to make sure it hasn't come back, from what I've seen in the documents so far. And finally, gypsy moth, another case where it's very difficult to control, but they do have a lot of plans for managing with pesticides and other means of control. So over time, you can see that in the early 2000s, that's where we see the longhorn beetle start to be mentioned. And there starts to be a spike in the longhorn beetle, which is this orange line. But then it quickly goes down when people were pretty sure it was eradicated. And then I think you can see the black line is emerald ash borer going up over time and then starting to go down, probably because I think it's been assessed and the effect is great, very great, but there's not much that the authority thinks that it can do. And then there's been a low but steady mention of gypsy moth since the mid 2000s. Okay, so next steps with this project. So what we'll do is disaggregate the records, like the occurrence records from the mentions in like the main text of policy documents, and also Mark is going to work on some like Royal Ontario Museum records of when the species arrived, kind of see like how the records relate to the policy mentions. And what we'll also do is take the policy documents and run a computational method of topic modeling on them to see what kinds of themes come up alongside invasive species management. So yeah, when, I don't know, maybe like one of the topics might be something like pesticide use or methods of control, and we'll be able to see like the other kinds of themes that come up when invasive species are discussed. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the paper will, in general, speak to the policy steps in the models of the stages of social problems. And for the case of invasive species, we'll look at the different types of models that have been discussed in the social problems literature. Say, which model fits the case of invasive species in Toronto the best, or if none of them really fit to propose an alternative model for this case and similar cases. So thanks very much. So yeah, if you have any questions or also any suggestions of different ways this data could be